Jason was 87 years old, living in a small town called Graceville, Missouri. His life, much like the old car he had cared for and maintained over the years, was reliable, but had lost its former luster. Jason had been a Vietnam War veteran, and, like his beloved truck, his life had endured much, leaving permanent marks on his soul. In recent years, his days consisted of quiet, simple pleasures, walking down the streets of his town, working in his garden, and spending long evenings in his chair by the fireplace. The old Chevrolet Silverado he had bought in the early 70s was more than just a vehicle. It was a link to his past, a piece of history he cherished. It had become a symbol of survival through the worst of what life had thrown his way. But to the townspeople, especially the younger generation, it was just an outdated rusted hulk. They constantly mocked his truck, calling it a rust bucket, and referring to Jason as the old man with the junker. Despite their teasing, Jason didn't care. For him, what mattered was that he had kept the truck all these years, through all the challenges, just as he had held onto his own life through hardships. The truck was like his journey, a bit rough around the edges, not perfect, but resilient. His son, Danny, was one of the few people who truly understood Jason. Danny, a soldier in the U.S. Army, was a source of immense pride for his father. Every time Danny came home, he would share stories of the latest technology, weapons, and vehicles he had been working with in the military. Jason admired his son's accomplishments, but also felt the distance that had grown between them over the years. Their worlds were so different now, despite the deep bond they shared. One day, Danny came home with something that would turn heads in the small town. He had brought a military-grade Hummer, a massive, imposing vehicle that exuded power and status. The Hummer was the very opposite of Jason's old Silverado, new, sleek, and expensive, a symbol of modern strength and achievement. As Danny drove it up the long driveway to his father's house, the sound of the Hummer's engine reverberated in the quiet air, contrasting sharply with the steady hum of Jason's aging truck. The townspeople, who had once mocked Jason's old vehicle, now watched in awe. The sight of the Hummer, a military icon, was something they couldn't ignore, and their attention shifted from the old man in his rickety truck to the younger generation, driving a piece of military history. Jason, for all the pride he felt for his son, couldn't help but feel a sense of displacement. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the strength and security the Hummer represented. It was simply that the contrast between the two vehicles felt like a reminder of how much had changed. His son's life was moving forward. His achievements were being recognized, and yet here he was, stuck in his past, surrounded by memories that no one seemed to care about anymore. Jason knew that his son's success was his success, but the weight of time and the evolving world seemed to pull them further apart with each passing day. He still took pride in his old Silverado, though. For Jason, it wasn't just about nostalgia or holding on to something from the past. It was about the connection to everything that had shaped him. That old truck had been with him through so many stages of life, the trials of war, the battles at home, the family he had raised, and the quiet moments of reflection. It wasn't just a machine to him, it was a testament to his endurance, his perseverance. But as he sat in his rocking chair, watching his son drive away in the Hummer, Jason couldn't deny the creeping feeling of change. It wasn't just the truck that had become an object of ridicule. It was the world around him, the people who didn't understand, the town that seemed to have moved on without him. And as Danny's vehicle roared down the road, Jason realized that no matter how much he clung to his past, the future was no longer within his reach. Still, he would hold on to what he could, the truck, the memories, the pride that came from surviving it all. The day Danny brought the Hummer home was a turning point for Jason. The moment the massive military-grade vehicle rolled into the driveway, it didn't go unnoticed. His neighbors, particularly the younger crowd, couldn't believe their eyes. The son of the old man with the rust bucket had arrived driving an extravagant high-powered vehicle. They whispered and laughed among themselves, marveling at the stark contrast between Jason's aging truck and Danny's polished, imposing Hummer. Jason stood on the porch, watching as his son backed the Hummer into the driveway, and felt a peculiar sense of pride. He understood that this was more than just a symbol of wealth or status. It was a reminder that, even in his old age, he could still be proud of the man his son had become, someone who had served his country and had earned the respect of many. But as the neighbors continued to gossip, Jason noticed the tone shift. What initially had been awe and admiration slowly transformed into something else. The whispers grew louder, more pointed. The comments no longer celebrated Danny's success, but started to reveal the underlying judgments of the townspeople. They said things like, "Well, looks like the old man's son has finally come to his senses," as though the Hummer was proof that Danny had somehow transcended his upbringing. The judgment wasn't just about the car, it was about Jason himself. It was as if the neighbors believed that Danny's new life in the military and his flashy vehicle somehow made him better, and by extension, made Jason's old truck a representation of his life and his choices obsolete. Jason felt a deep conflict within him. On one hand, he was undeniably proud of his son. Danny had achieved so much, and Jason recognized that the Hummer wasn't just a piece of machinery, it was a reflection of the man Danny had become, someone who had risen above difficult circumstances and served his country with distinction. Yet, on the other hand, Jason couldn't help but feel a growing sense of alienation. It wasn't just the car that created the divide. It was the unspoken truth that Danny and the people in their town seemed to view his past, his sacrifices, and his simple, humble life as something to be ashamed of. The more Jason thought about it, the more he realized that Danny, despite his pride in his achievements, had never fully understood the value of Jason's past. To Danny, the Hummer was the ultimate proof of success, of making it in the world. But to Jason, that old Chevrolet Silverado, with its rust and worn-out parts, was the embodiment of his resilience, his life story, and his survival through some of the hardest years of his life. The Hummer represented the future, and the Silverado represented the past, two vastly different worlds that seemed to be drifting farther apart with each passing year. As he stood on the porch watching the neighbors laugh and point, Jason couldn't help but feel like he was being left behind. The pride he had felt earlier began to sour as he realized how much the world had changed. In Danny's eyes, the Hummer was a symbol of progress, but to Jason, it felt like a stark reminder of how little the world valued his own journey. The military service, the scars, the memories, none of that seemed to matter anymore. What mattered now was the shiny, powerful vehicle that Danny had driven in on, a modern icon of success that Jason couldn't quite relate to. The more Jason thought about it, the more the weight of the situation pressed on him. The Hummer wasn't just a car, it was a reflection of everything that had changed in his life, and everything that had been left behind. He didn't know how to bridge the gap between the life he had lived and the world Danny and the others now inhabited. As his son drove away, Jason stood in the quiet of his porch, feeling a strange mix of pride, confusion, and a growing sense of loss. As the days went by, the tension in Graysville only grew. Jason continued to drive his old Chevrolet, a truck that had seen better days despite the constant mockery he had learned to ignore in the past. But now the ridicule seemed sharper, more deliberate. His old truck was no longer just a vehicle. It had become a symbol of everything the younger generation despised. Every time he drove through the town, the snickers and laughter followed him like a shadow. The kids from the local high school would point and whisper, unable to suppress their amusement. They didn't see the history, the years of hard work, or the pride that Jason had poured into maintaining his truck. To them, it was simply an outdated, rusted relic of the past, something they couldn't understand or appreciate. Jason tried his best to block out the noise, to keep his focus on the things that mattered to him, but it became harder and harder. The mocking laughter began to pierce his defenses, digging into him deeper than he had expected. Each sneer, each pointed finger felt like a personal attack on his identity. He had always prided himself on his ability to endure, to stand tall in the face of adversity. But this was different. This wasn't about surviving a war or working through hardships. It was about being rejected by the very people he had lived among for so many years. It wasn't just his truck they were mocking, it was everything he represented. For the first time, Jason felt the weight of isolation. He had always thought of himself as a part of the town, as someone who had seen things most people would never understand. But now, with his truck constantly under scrutiny, he felt like an outsider in his own community. The young people of Graysville didn't care about the stories his truck held, the memories it carried. They saw only its imperfections. And as much as he tried to ignore it, the sense of alienation grew stronger each day. Jason spent long nights in his old rocking chair, staring at the fading light outside, lost in thought. He thought about how much had changed in the world since he had returned from Vietnam. He remembered the days when people respected their elders, when a person's worth wasn't measured by the car they drove or the clothes they wore. But now, it seemed like everything was about appearances, about having the newest and the best. His old truck, his steadfast companion, seemed to have no place in that world. The world had moved on, leaving him and his memories behind. He began to wonder if it was time to let go of the past. Maybe it was time to sell the Chevrolet, to buy something newer, something that would make him blend in better with the rest of the town. He had spent years holding on to this symbol of his past, but now he wasn't sure if it was worth the emotional toll it was taking on him. He had nothing but memories tied to that truck, memories that felt increasingly distant, increasingly irrelevant in a world that no longer valued them. At the same time, a part of him resisted. The thought of selling the Chevrolet, of letting go of the one thing that had been constant in his life, left a bitter taste in his mouth. It felt like betraying something that had been a part of him for so long. The truck wasn't just metal and leather. It was a part of his story, a reminder of who he was and what he had been through. And yet, the more the town mocked him, the more that connection began to feel tenuous. How long could he keep holding on to something that everyone else had already discarded? Jason spent several days wrestling with the idea. The loneliness gnawed at him, and the desire to be understood, to be accepted, grew stronger with each passing day. Maybe a new truck would make people stop laughing, would make him feel less like a relic. But every time he thought about it, something deep inside him pushed back. He wasn't sure if he was ready to give up on the past, even if the past no longer seemed to have a place in the world around him. In the silence of his home, Jason couldn't help but feel like an old man clinging to a piece of a world that no longer existed. Yet he knew that the choice he faced wasn't just about a truck. It was about something deeper, something that had to do with his identity, his legacy, and his place in the world. The question wasn't just whether he should sell the truck. It was whether he could still hold on to who he was in a world that seemed to be moving away from everything he had once known. One evening, as Jason was returning from the local store, he noticed several cars filled with young people pulling up next to his old truck. The sounds of loud laughter and shouting reached his ears before he even got close. He could hear the insults being thrown his way as the group of teenagers made fun of the condition of his Chevrolet. They taunted him about how they had been waiting for his old clunker to fall apart so they could pick it up for parts. Their voices were sharp and mocking, cutting through the quiet evening air. One of the young men approached his truck, moving closer with an air of arrogance. He began to slap the side of the vehicle, his fingers leaving marks on the faded metal. Jason stood frozen in place, his hand on the door handle of his own truck, unsure of how to respond. The words cut through him in a way that felt different from all the jabs he had endured over the years. This time, the ridicule felt personal. It wasn't just about his truck anymore. It was about him, about who he had become in the eyes of these strangers. Jason could feel his age more sharply now. The years had not been kind to him, and the slow creeping of weakness in his body was something he could no longer ignore. His back ached, and his hands trembled slightly as he clenched his fists. For a moment he wondered if he was too old for this, if he should just let it all go. Maybe the town was right. Maybe he was just a relic, something that didn't belong anymore. He stood there, unable to move or speak, as the young man continued to tap on the truck with an almost gleeful expression. The others laughed loudly, and Jason could see the contempt in their eyes. To them, he was just another old man who had outlived his usefulness, clinging to his past with a beat-up vehicle that no longer had a place in the world. The truck, which had once been a proud symbol of his history, was now nothing more than a punchline. As he watched the group drive away, Jason felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness wash over him. The town that had once been his home, the place where he had raised his family and spent most of his life, no longer felt like a place of belonging. The connection he had once felt with the people around him, the respect he had earned through his service and his years of hard work, seemed to have evaporated. Now all they saw when they looked at him was an old man with a broken car, someone who didn't fit into their fast-moving, image-driven world. In the days that followed, Jason spent more and more time in solitude, walking around his yard or sitting on the porch, staring out at the familiar streets of Graysville. He thought about the past, his days in Vietnam, the sacrifices he had made, the pride he had once felt in serving his country. But all those memories now seemed distant, like they belonged to someone else. The more he reflected on his life, the more he realized that he had lost touch with the world around him. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had become irrelevant. He thought about his son, Danny, and the Hummer that had arrived like a symbol of everything Jason felt he had failed to understand. Danny was part of the new world, a world where success was measured by material things, by status symbols, by how well you fit into the rapidly changing society. Jason wasn't sure if Danny could ever understand what it was like to grow up in a time when things were different, when pride wasn't so easily bought or sold. Jason tried to tell himself that it didn't matter, that he didn't need anyone's approval. But the harsh reality of the situation was beginning to wear him down. He didn't want to be forgotten. He didn't want to be the old man with the rusty truck that everyone laughed at. He wanted to be remembered for something more, something meaningful. But it seemed like the world was moving on without him. In those quiet moments of reflection, he made a decision. He couldn't keep living like this, letting the mockery of others dictate his sense of self. Even if the world no longer saw him the way he saw himself, even if he had become invisible to the younger generation, he couldn't give up. He had given too much to this country, to his family, to the life he had built. No matter how many times he was laughed at, no matter how many times the world turned its back on him, he would stand his ground. Jason wasn't ready to be defeated. He wasn't ready to let go of the past, even if it didn't have a place in the future. And so he decided to fight back, not with anger or bitterness, but with the quiet strength that had always defined him. He would no longer hide in the shadows of his past. If the world didn't understand him, then he would find a way to make them see. It wasn't about the truck or the laughs or the opinions of others. It was about his dignity, his legacy, and the respect he had earned. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would make sure that respect wasn't forgotten. The following day, Jason decided to drive his old Chevrolet to the local park. He needed some time alone, away from the constant barrage of mockery that had followed him since Danny's arrival in town. As he drove through the streets of Graysville, the usual jeers and laughter echoed from the sidewalks. The young people still found amusement in his rusted truck, their voices filled with disdain. But this time, Jason didn't let their taunts affect him. He had long ago learned to ignore the ridicule, and today it felt even easier to push it aside. He focused on the road ahead, letting the steady hum of the engine soothe his thoughts. As he pulled into the park and parked his truck under the shade of an old oak tree, Jason took a moment to gather himself. The park was quiet, with only a few people walking their dogs or sitting on the benches. Jason enjoyed these peaceful moments, where he could escape from the noise and the judgment of the town. He turned off the engine and sat there for a while, looking at the familiar surroundings that had been a part of his life for so many years. It wasn't long before Jason heard the distinct roar of an engine in the distance. He turned his head, just in time to see a large military Hummer coming around the corner, its polished exterior gleaming in the afternoon sun. His heart skipped a beat as the vehicle came closer, and he recognized the figure behind the wheel. It was Danny, his son, driving the same Hummer that had caused such a stir when he had first arrived in Graysville. Danny slowed the vehicle as he approached Jason's truck and parked it right next to him. He stepped out of the Hummer with the same confidence that had marked his arrival in town, his uniform sharp and crisp, his hat adorned with stars. Jason watched him, a mix of pride and something deeper welling up inside of him. The young man before him was no longer just his son. He was a symbol of everything Jason had fought for, of the legacy of service that had shaped his own life. Yet at that moment, Jason saw something else in Danny. It wasn't just the military power, the impressive vehicle, or the uniform that filled him with pride. It was the realization that Danny had come back to show him how far he had gone, the life he had built, the accomplishments he had achieved. Danny wasn't just flaunting his success. He was trying to share it with Jason, hoping to bridge the gap between their worlds. For a brief moment, Jason felt the weight of the years between them, the distance that had grown over time. It wasn't just the difference in age or in their experiences. It was the divide between the world Jason had known and the one Danny was now part of. The world of veterans and war heroes was something Jason could relate to, but the world Danny inhabited was foreign to him, a place where power, status, and image seemed to matter more than anything else. Jason wondered if he would ever truly understand it, or if he was destined to remain an outsider in his own son's life. But as Danny stood there, his posture relaxed but confident, Jason couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. His son had chosen a path that, in many ways, had been different from his own. Danny had become a part of a world that Jason couldn't entirely comprehend, but he had done so with honor, with dedication, and with the same sense of duty that Jason had carried throughout his own life. It was clear that Danny had succeeded in his own way, and Jason couldn't help but feel grateful that his son was here, alive, and well, standing beside him. In that moment, Jason realized that his feelings of frustration and alienation, while real, were only part of the story. There was more to his life and more to his relationship with Danny than just the old truck, the mockery, or the differences between their experiences. His son was his family, his flesh and blood, and despite their differences, they shared a deep bond that time and circumstances couldn't erase. Jason knew that, even if they didn't always see eye to eye, they had both fought for the same values, the same country, and the same future. As the wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree, Jason sat in silence, taking in the sight of his son, the man he had raised, standing beside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The world around him might have changed, and the people in it might not always understand him. But in this moment, standing next to his son, Jason realized that his own legacy was not just in the rusted truck or the memories of war. It was in the man his son had become. Several days passed, and with each one, Jason's thoughts became clearer. His time spent in the quiet of the park, the long drives with his worn-out truck, and the moments of reflection gave him a new perspective on the life he had lived. He could no longer focus on the ridicule or the mockery that had once consumed him. His son, Danny, had become a successful man, a soldier who had found his place in a world Jason sometimes struggled to understand. But that success, Jason realized, wasn't born out of privilege or fortune. It was rooted in the lessons Jason had taught him: resilience, conviction, and the value of standing firm for what was right. Danny had learned these things from his father, and he had applied them in his own life in a way that made Jason proud. In that moment of realization, Jason saw that his own life, though marked by hardship and sacrifice, was something to be proud of. His old Chevrolet Silverado wasn't just a beat-up vehicle. It was a symbol of the strength he had shown throughout the years, a tangible reminder of the battles he had fought, both abroad and in his own life. The dents, the rust, the worn out seats, all of these were part of the story of who Jason was. The truck had been with him through the most difficult times, carrying him through struggles, loss, and moments of loneliness. It was a piece of his soul, a reflection of everything he had endured. Jason realized that, in a way, his past wasn't something to be ashamed of. His past had shaped him into the man he was today, and it had shaped his son as well. The old truck was a part of that legacy. It wasn't just a car. It was a vessel of his history, his strength, and the principles he had lived by. In a world that seemed to care more about appearances and wealth, Jason had always valued resilience over glamour. His truck, battered and rusty, was a testament to that value. It had never been about looking good for others. It had always been about getting through each day, no matter how tough it got. With that newfound understanding, Jason knew what he had to do. He wouldn't let the mockery of the town dictate how he felt anymore. His life, his choices, and the things he had achieved, both in service to his country and in raising his son, were not to be overshadowed by the opinions of others. He would no longer let the cruel words and the judgment from the younger generation make him question his worth. He had already proven himself in ways that mattered most, and his legacy was one that no one could take away from him. So, with quiet determination, Jason decided it was time to get back behind the wheel of his Chevrolet. He had spent too many days in self-doubt, but now he was ready to embrace his past fully. He didn't need to justify his choices to anyone. The road ahead, though full of uncertainty, would be his to drive. As he slid into the worn driver's seat, the familiar scent of old leather and gasoline filled his nostrils. His hands gripped the steering wheel, and for the first time in a long while, Jason felt a sense of peace. As the engine roared to life, Jason's heart swelled with pride. He wasn't just driving a car. He was driving a piece of his history, a history that had meaning. He drove down the familiar streets of Graysville, his old truck standing strong against the backdrop of a world that didn't always understand him. The young people who had once laughed at him and his truck were still out there, but now Jason no longer cared about their opinions. They could laugh if they wanted, but the truth was, Jason knew something they didn't. He had lived through things they could never understand, and he had come out stronger for it. As he drove past the town square and down the familiar roads, Jason realized that it wasn't the truck that had changed. It was him. He had found peace within himself, and with that peace, the judgment of others no longer had the power to hurt him. He was proud of who he was, and he was proud of the life he had led. The old Chevrolet wasn't a symbol of weakness. It was a symbol of strength, endurance, and the resilience to keep going no matter how hard life got. Jason drove toward the outskirts of town, where the field stretched out as far as the eye could see. He felt the wind in his hair and the sun on his face, and for the first time in years, he felt free. The past was behind him, and though it had shaped him, it no longer held him captive. He was moving forward, not for the approval of anyone else, but for himself. And as he drove, he knew that he had nothing left to prove.